There are scenes in television that you watch and you think, okay, that was well acted. That was well written. Nicely done, moving on. And then there are scenes that stop you. Not because of the music swelling at just the right moment or the camera doing something clever, but because something on screen doesn't feel like performance anymore. It feels like it crossed some invisible line into something realer than fiction is supposed to be. You find yourself holding your breath without deciding to. You finish the scene, and you just sit there for a second, not quite ready to press play on the next thing. The proposal scene in Boston Blue is one of those scenes. And what makes it even more interesting, more worth really digging into, is that Maggie Lawson herself has talked about why filming it hit differently. Why that day on set was unlike almost anything else she's experienced making this show. Because when an actor tells you a scene was emotionally difficult, sometimes it's just a thing actors say. It's part of the vocabulary of press tours and promotional interviews. But when you hear Maggie talk about this particular moment, about what it meant to her and what it meant for Sarah, you realize she's not reaching for something to say. She's trying to put words around something that genuinely got to her. And that's a very different thing. So let's actually talk about it. Let's talk about why this proposal scene carries the weight it does, what it means for Sarah as a character, and why it might be one of the most emotionally layered moments Boston Blue has produced. To understand why this scene hits so hard, you have to understand Sarah. Not just who she is in the present tense of the show, but where she came from, what she's been carrying. Sarah is not a character who came into this story uncomplicated. She arrived with history, with losses and choices and a version of herself that had learned, somewhere along the way, to hold the most important things at arm's length. Not out of coldness. The opposite, actually. Out of a very specific kind of protectiveness that people develop when they've been hurt in ways that redefined what hurt feels like. You build walls not because you don't care, but because you care so much that the idea of losing again is the thing that genuinely terrifies you. What Boston Blue has done with Sarah over the course of this series is the work of genuinely patient storytelling. It hasn't rushed her toward openness. It hasn't forced her transformation through dramatic plot mechanics. It's let her move at the speed of a real person who is slowly, cautiously, choosing to trust the ground beneath her feet again. And Maggie Lawson has played every stage of that journey with a kind of interior honesty that makes Sarah feel less like a TV character and more like someone you actually know. By the time you get to the proposal scene, you've traveled a long road with this woman. You've seen her at her most offended and her most vulnerable. You've seen her fight for other people's safety with everything she has while simultaneously keeping a careful distance from her own happiness. So when that moment arrives, when the question gets asked and the world kind of holds still, it's not just a romantic milestone. It's the culmination of an entire emotional arc. It's Sarah finally saying yes to her own life. That's not a small thing. That's enormous. And then there's May. I want to spend real time here because May is central to why this scene works as deeply as it does, and I don't think she always gets the credit she deserves in conversations about this show. May occupies a very specific and irreplaceable space in Sarah's emotional world. She's not a colleague, not a friend in the conventional sense. She's something closer to what Sarah needed and didn't always have. A maternal presence. Someone who sees her fully and loves what she sees without condition or agenda. For a character like Sarah, who carries so much of her past in the way she holds herself, the way she measures her words, the way she monitors her own softness as though it were a liability, having someone like May in her life is genuinely transformative. Not in a lightning bolt way, in the slow, quiet, cumulative way that real love transforms people. May has been there through the uncertainty and the setbacks and the moments where Sarah was figuring out whether she was allowed to want what she wanted. She has been, in every sense that matters, family. Not assigned family. Chosen family. The kind you build out of loyalty and time and showing up. So when the ring that becomes the centerpiece of this proposal turns out to carry May's history, May's love story woven into its physical existence, the symbolism doesn't feel constructed. It feels inevitable. It feels like the show saying, this is what connection actually looks like. Not the grand gesture arriving from nowhere, but the meaning that accumulates over years between people who have chosen each other again and again. The ring isn't just jewelry. It's a lineage of love being passed forward. It's May saying, in the most tangible way possible, you belong to this story now. And for Sarah, for a woman who has spent so much of her life feeling like she existed slightly outside the warm circle of belonging, receiving that is almost too much to hold. Which is exactly why Maggie Lawson has said filming it was the most emotional day she had on set. Because how do you not feel that? How do you hold a prop that carries that much narrative weight and keep yourself completely professional? You don't, is the answer. And that's what makes great television. Maggie has talked about the specific way the scene got to her. Not just the emotional logic of it, but the physical reality of standing there in that moment, in Sarah's clothes, in Sarah's life, and feeling the whole accumulated weight of everything this character has been through arrive at once. Actors talk about this sometimes. The experience of a scene where the character's emotion and your own become impossible to disentangle, where you stop performing the feeling and start actually having it. That's what she's describing. And you can see it if you watch the scene knowing what you now know. There's something in her face that isn't quite controlled in the way a fully composed performance is. It's present in a way that's slightly beyond technique. It's the real thing leaking through, and it doesn't weaken the performance. It is the performance. That kind of truth in acting is what separates a scene that moves you from a scene that marks you. And this scene marks you. Then there's Seth, and I think his performance in this moment deserves its own close reading because it's doing something very specific that's easy to undervalue. Seth's approach to the proposal is notably understated. There's no theatrical nervousness, no practice speech delivered at full emotional volume. He's quiet. He's almost careful. And at first glance you might read that as restraint for restraint's sake, but I think it's something more intentional than that. Seth knows Sarah. He knows what she needs from this moment. And what she doesn't need is something that feels like a performance put on for her benefit, something she has to respond to rather than simply receive. The quietness of his approach is, in itself, an act of love. He's creating space. He's saying, I'm not asking you to react to how I'm doing this. I'm just asking you. That's it. Just you and me in this question. And in the context of who Sarah is, that is exactly right. Any bigger gesture would have triggered her defenses. Any more theatrical delivery would have put her on the outside of the moment, watching it happen rather than living inside it. The softness of how Seth asks is what makes it possible for her to say yes with her whole self rather than just her composed surface. That's character-informed acting. That's two people who understand their characters so completely that they've found the precise emotional register the scene requires. It's quiet alchemy, and it works. Now, I want to talk about something that the episode does structurally, because the proposal scene doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's happening alongside Danny and Baez's storyline, and the emotional contrast between those two arcs is not accidental. It's deliberate, and it deepens both. Danny and Baez are in a place of grief and struggle. They're carrying something heavy, working through something that hasn't resolved and won't resolve easily. The episode doesn't soften that. It holds the full weight of their pain without flinching. And so you have, within the same hour of television, a story of profound loss and a story of profound love arriving simultaneously. Sarah saying yes to her future. Danny and Baez in the middle of a wound that isn't closing yet. And the genius of that structural choice is that it doesn't make the proposal feel cheap or the grief feel decorative. It makes both feel truer, because that's how life actually is. Grief and joy don't schedule themselves around each other. They coexist. They happen in the same hours, to people in the same orbit, without caring about the irony. The world doesn't pause its sorrow to accommodate your happiness or pause your happiness out of respect for someone else's sorrow. It just moves. And Boston Blue, by holding both of these emotional realities at the same time, is honoring the actual texture of how human beings live. It also creates a kind of resonance between the storylines that makes each one heavier and more significant. Sarah's proposal is sweeter because you feel the weight of what's happening across the precinct. Danny and Baez's struggle is somehow more bearable because you've just watched something beautiful happen. The episode asks you to hold both, and it trusts you to do it. That's a mature piece of television. That's a show operating at the height of its emotional intelligence. What I keep coming back to, thinking about this scene and about what Maggie has said about it, is the theme underneath all of it. The one that ties Sarah's arc together from the beginning to this moment. Grief and healing. The way those two things aren't opposites, but a process. You don't finish grieving and then start healing. You don't put down one and pick up the other. You carry them both, and over time, gradually, imperfectly on a timeline that doesn't follow a pattern, the weight shifts. The grief becomes something you can hold differently. It changes shape, and the space it leaves, when it finally does loosen, is exactly the shape of what you need to move forward. Sarah's yes in this proposal scene is the sound of that space finally being filled. It's not the end of her grief. She's not finished being who loss made her, but she's choosing, consciously and fully, to let love into the space that's opened up. And that is the bravest, most human thing a person can do. Maggie Lawson gets that. She said as much, talking about what Sarah means to her and why playing her has been meaningful in ways that go beyond craft. There's something in Sarah's journey that she's connected to personally, not in terms of identical life experience, but in terms of understanding the emotional truth of it. The way protection becomes a habit. The way trust has to be rebuilt slowly after it's been fractured. The way joy, when it finally arrives after a long absence, can feel almost too large to let in all at once. That personal connection is what you feel in her performance. It's what made that day on set the most emotional one. Not because the script demanded it, but because the scene touched something real. And that's ultimately what separates good television from great television. Not the production value, not the plot mechanics, not even the writing, though the writing here is genuinely strong. It's this. It's the moments when the story and the performer and the character converge on something true, and the result goes beyond entertainment into something that actually reaches you. The proposal scene in Boston Blue reaches you. It earned the emotion it asks for. It built toward it carefully, honored it fully, and trusted the audience to feel it without being told how. Maggie Lawson saying it was the most emotional day on set isn't a promotional soundbite. It's a report from the inside of a scene that genuinely meant something. And the fact that it translates, the fact that you can see it and feel it as a viewer, is the whole ballgame, really. That's what any of us who love television are hoping for every time we press play. Sometimes the story knows exactly what it's doing. Sometimes an actor finds the exact center of a moment. Sometimes they line up so precisely that something beautiful and irreducible happens on screen. This was one of those times. Tell me in the comments, did the scene get to you the way it got to me? And what do you think it means for Sarah's story going forward? Because I have thoughts, and I have a feeling you do too. Subscribe if you want to keep having these conversations.